4 days before my wedding, I found an envelope under my windshield wiper. Inside, just one line, "Your family is not welcome." That was the moment I realized I wasn't just marrying June Dalton. I was inheriting 3 generations of war. I was standing by my truck on a humid Alabama afternoon when I found the envelope. It wasn't tucked neatly in the mailbox, wasn't slid under the door. It was wedged beneath the wiper blade of my old Ford like someone had wanted it to be seen before anything else. The heat had softened the glue, so when I tore it open, the paper stuck to my fingers. The words inside were short, typed in a harsh black font. "Your family has no place at this wedding. Do not come. For everyone's sake, stay away." No signature. No return address. Just a blade of sentences that cut deeper than anything I'd ever read. My first thought was not about myself, but about my grandmother Ida. She had told me more than once that grudges in our town were planted deeper than pecan trees, and they grew thicker with every passing season. I could almost hear her voice. "Boy, this land never forgets." The Macaulays and the Daltons had been at odds since before I was born. According to family legend, it started with my grandmother and hers, 2 women who once shared a church pew, but ended up quarreling over a strip of land by the river. One accused the other of moving a boundary marker after a flood. Maybe it was true, maybe it wasn't. But in small towns, truth is less important than who tells the story loudest. That single argument outlived both their husbands and carved a canyon between our families. Then came the next generation, my father, Jesse Macaulay, and her father, Clark Dalton. My dad fixed cars, Clark sold building supplies. At first, their businesses didn't overlap, but pride doesn't need a reason. A lost customer here, a snide comment there, and soon both men treated Main Street like a battleground. Dad used to spit the name Dalton as if it were poison. Clark, in turn, refused to step foot in our shop, even when his own truck broke down. The feud wasn't a story anymore. It was air, water, gravity. Something you breathed without knowing it. And now it had come to us, me and June Dalton, the grandchildren, the 2 foolish enough, or brave enough, to believe love could rewrite an old script. When I asked her to marry me, I thought we were starting fresh. I thought we'd finally end what our families had dragged on for decades. But that letter in my hands told me otherwise. I leaned against the truck bed, the cicadas screaming so loudly they sounded like static. The words on the page blurred, and for a moment I wondered if it was really happening. We'd spent months planning. June had chosen the lace for her dress, simple and light, and I had picked out the rings, gold with a small pearl that had belonged to my grandmother. We didn't want a showy ceremony, just a church on a hill and a long table beneath the pecan trees in my grandmother's yard. It was supposed to be about us, not about the past. Yet here I was, staring at a message that told me my blood was unwelcome, that the sins of Ida and Jesse would not be forgiven, not even when their grandson stood ready to make vows of peace. I folded the letter, too carefully, and slipped it into my pocket. My palms were sweating. I didn't need to guess who had sent it. In my bones, I felt the shadow of her parents. They had smiled when we announced the engagement, but it was the kind of smile you give at a funeral, tight, joyless, waiting for the coffin to close. I climbed into the cab, but my hands wouldn't touch the ignition. Instead, I reached for my phone. There was only one person who deserved to read the words with me, who deserved to know before I lost my nerve. When June answered, her voice was bright, unaware. "Hey, Eli, you ready for the rehearsal dinner?" I couldn't even manage a smile. "June," I said, "I found something. You'd better come see it." June arrived 20 minutes later in her blue Toyota, dust rising behind her like smoke from a fire. She stepped out still in her work clothes in the lumber yard, jeans with sawdust on the knees, hair pulled back, her eyes alert as a hawk's. She carried a thermos of coffee, because she knew me too well. I didn't drink from it. Not yet. I only handed her the folded letter. She spread it flat on the hood of my truck. Her hands shook as she read, though her face tried to stay calm. When she looked up, her jaw was set the way it always was when she wanted to be brave. "This isn't my father," she whispered. "He doesn't hide behind paper. If he wanted to tell you to your face, he would." I nodded. "Then who?" Her eyes narrowed. My mother, maybe? Or, she stopped, biting her lip. No, it could be anybody. That's the problem with grudges. They don't stay in one pair of hands. They spread. We stood there listening to the cicadas, the low groan of trucks on Highway 43, and the buzzing in our own chests. The letter lay between us like an old snake that had crawled out of the family attic, alive and hissing. I thought back to when I first met her. It wasn't a fairy tale, not even close. I was under the hood of Mr. Leland's beat-up Ford by the water tower, grease on my elbows, when she drove up with a load of planks to the high school stage. One of her straps had snapped, and she was wrestling the boards like a soldier with flag. I lent her a ratchet strap, and she looked at me with that mix of gratitude and suspicion unique to people who know your last name. "Thanks, Macaulay," she'd said, and though the word was plain, it sounded like a challenge. That was how it always was with us. Every smile, every touch carried the weight of history. At the Friday football games, I'd sit on one side of the bleachers and she on the other, sneaking glances across the crowd, as if we were guilty of something. People whispered. Some whispered kindly, some cruelly, but all whispered. I used to ask myself why. Why had two families let anger turn into tradition? My grandmother Ida swore the Daltons had stolen land by the river decades ago. Clark Dalton swore my family had spread lies about his father during the flood years. The stories changed depending on who told them, but the bitterness was always the same. By the time our parents inherited it, the details didn't matter anymore. What mattered was loyalty. You stood with your blood, or you were a traitor. And now here we were, trying to write a different chapter, only to find the ink poisoned before it touched the page. June traced the words on the letter, as if memorizing them. "Whoever wrote this," she said, "wants us to keep living their fight. They want our wedding to be another battlefield. Maybe they'll succeed," I said bitterly. "If my folks aren't welcome, then what's left? Just me and you, standing alone." Her hand found mine across the hood. "That's enough. But I don't want it that way. I don't want our marriage to begin in exile." For a moment, I pictured the ceremony we had planned. The church with its white clapboard walls. Pastor Weston fumbling through his notes. The long table under Grandma Ida's pecan trees, lanterns hanging like tiny moons. Children chasing fireflies while old neighbors drank sweet tea and laughed. That vision had carried me through months of work, through long nights at the garage when my hands ached and my back burned. Now, it trembled like a house in storm. "We'll find out who sent it," I told her. "And when we do, we'll decide what to do next. But I promise you this, our wedding will not be another casualty of this feud." Her eyes softened. "You sound like a soldier." I laughed without humor. "That's what it feels like, June. Like I was drafted into a war the day I was born." I looked at her then, really looked. She wasn't just a Dalton. She was a girl who stayed late to finish her shift, the woman who carried strength in her shoulders and kindness in her voice. She was a reason I still believed peace was possible. And standing there, with the sun sinking red over the Alabama hills, I swore that if love couldn't end this feud, then nothing ever would. Truth doesn't hide under roots and stones anymore. It hides on screens. June and I drove to the Dalton Supply Yard after closing, when the forklifts were asleep and the sodium lights hummed. We weren't there to break into anything, only to look at what any employee could see. The printer sat in the corner under a plastic fern. June woke it with a touch. "Job history," she whispered. A list appeared. Dates, times, file names, usernames. That letter had been typed. Whoever sent it had left footprints in fresh mud. There was 2 days ago, for 13 p.m. notice_guest_policy.pdf. User, Bobby Ray. 1 copy. 5 pages. My mouth went dry. Bobby Ray Dalton was June's cousin, the kind of man who believed 2 things with holy fervor. The world owed him a head start, and he could spot trouble before anyone else. "Don't," June said, as if I were about to march straight to his house. "Let's ask him, not accuse. Ask." The door opened and Bobby Ray stepped inside, jangling keys, whistling Sweet Home Alabama. He froze when he saw us by the printer. "What are y'all doing here?" he asked too brightly. "Looking at print jobs," June said. "Tell me why your username is on a file that reads like a threat." You think I June, come on. Then say you didn't. Silence, then a shrug. I wrote something up, sure. Folks are nervous. People talk. Last time our families mixed, somebody slashed a tire. Maybe it was lightning, maybe Macaulay. I figured I'd keep the peace by pouring gasoline, I said. He squared his shoulders toward me. Look, Eli, you're a nice boy from the wrong porch. Your grandmother's fine. Your father, not so much. You want to marry June? Fine. But why invite your whole clan and wait for a fight? June didn't blink. Because they are his people. Because I invited them. Because I am not a child you manage with secrets and stationery. For a second, he swallowed that. Then the grin returned. Aunt Luann will thank me when this blows over. Did my mother ask you to do it? June asked. He hesitated. She said she wished it could be smaller, that your daddy and his aren't built for the same room. I did the math. You did the damage, I said. Bobby Ray lifted his hands. You're marrying a Dalton. We hold the line. Which line? I asked. The one by the river my grandmother talked about, or the one you just printed and shoved under my wiper blade? His face flushed. You don't know history. I know enough to stop repeating it, I said. And I know the difference between protecting family and choking it. June touched my arm. She turned back to him. You will call every Macaulay and apologize if they heard a whisper of this. You will not speak for me again. If you're worried about tempers, bring them to me, not to a machine that spits out threats. He looked at her steadiness like it was something new. Fine, he muttered. I was trying to help. You were trying to stay comfortable, she said. That's not the same. I thought it was my dad. I admitted when we stepped outside, and I was ready to hate him for it. My dad does his damage in daylight, she said. He swings a hammer. Bobby writes memos. We drove to my grandmother's with the windows down. Ida was on the porch snapping beans into a metal bowl. She listened, hands moving, beans tap in the bowl. People move boundary posts when the river rises because they think no one is watching, she said. But somebody always is. Sometimes it's God. Sometimes it's an old woman watering tomatoes. Either way, the joke ends. What do we do now? I asked. You stand where the post should have been, she said. Invite people anyway. Put out lanterns and chairs. Feed who shows up. Don't chase who stays away. But don't hide. That's ordinary, Ida replied. Brave is loving after the guests go home. The next morning, I walked into my father's shop and found him elbow deep in a transmission. I told him about the letter, about Bobby Ray, about Grandma's plan. He set his wrench down with a clatter. So the Daltons insult us and we still show up smiling? We show up as ourselves, I said. We don't let one cousin decide our vows. He stared at the floor a long beat. There are wars you win by not marching, he said. And wars you win by walking straight through the parade. I ain't sure which this is. It's not a war, I said. It's a wedding. Your mother would have told me to hush and buy new boots. Fine, I'll be there. But if Clark Dalton sneers, I'm taking my plate and going home. Take 2 plates, I said, and somehow we both smiled. By sunset. June had spoken to her mother. Luann didn't confess. She didn't deny. She just said, it's been a hard few decades, and asked what pie we wanted if she still came. We didn't know who would show. We didn't know whether a tire would get slashed or a toast would drown in silence. But we knew this. We would not be the grandchildren who let ghosts write our vows. The morning of the wedding broke heavy with heat, the kind that makes shirts cling and tempers short. I was awake before dawn, not from nerves but from a sound of cicadas already tuning their endless instruments in the pines. My tie lay across the chair like a rope. My boots were polished, though I doubted anyone would notice. I stood at the window of my grandmother Ida's house and thought, if nobody comes, will it still be a wedding? June arrived in her aunt's Buick, dress folded carefully in the back seat, veil in a shoebox. She smiled when she saw me, but the smile was thin, stretched like fabric over splinters. We had no hall, no florist, no grand reception. We had Ida's yard, a dozen folding chairs, and strings of lanterns that I'd hung the night before with my cousins. Guests trickled in, slower than syrup. Some Macaulays, some Daltons, mostly neighbors who'd loved us since we were kids and refused to pick sides. When the old church bell rang 10 o'clock, we counted maybe 30 souls in the yard. Not the crowd we'd imagined, but enough to bear witness. Pastor Wesson opened his worn Bible and nodded for us to join hands. June's palm was damp, her pulse wild, but when I looked at her, everything else quieted. He began to speak of covenant, of patience, of laying down grudges the way farmers lay down seed. Each word was like a hammer, driving a nail into a coffin that deserved to be buried. But when the vows left my lips, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, I felt the ghost gather at the edges of the yard. My grandmother's feud, my father's anger, Clark Dalton's suspicion, Bobby Ray's cowardice. They pressed against us like smoke, and I wondered if words were strong enough to hold them back. Then came the I do, hers echoing mine, and something shifted. The ghost didn't vanish, but they lost their teeth. Applause rose, shy at first, then stronger. Kids clapped without knowing why. Ida wept into her handkerchief. My father cleared his throat like gravel. For a moment, just a moment, it felt like a new foundation. We moved to the tables beneath the pecans. Fried chicken, cornbread, sweet tea, casseroles. Dishes carried in by neighbors who knew that food can glue broken boards. The lantern swayed in the breeze, and laughter stumbled back into the air. That was when I saw them. Two figures at the far edge of the yard, standing stiff in Sunday clothes. Clark and June Dalton. June froze beside me, her fork halfway to her lips. The music faltered. Even the cicadas seemed to pause. My father rose halfway from his chair, jaw tight. For a second I thought he might walk off. But then he sat back down, eyes burning. Clark cleared his throat. His voice carried without a microphone. We came to say sorry. The words shocked the yard more than any curse could. This was the man who once spat on the floor of my father's shop. This was the man who swore a Macaulay handshake wasn't worth dirt. And now he looked smaller, his pride wrinkled like an old receipt. We let anger write too much of our story, Lewin added, her voice trembling. We hurt our children because we couldn't let go of what our parents fought over. That was wrong. Silence. Then Ida, my grandmother, stood. Her hand shook on her cane, but her eyes were bright. "Took you long enough," she said. And somehow, laughter bubbled across the tables. Nervous, thin but laughter. June squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. "Do we believe them?" she whispered. "I don't know," I whispered back. "But maybe belief starts like this, small and cracked." Clark lifted a glass of tea. Not wine, not whiskey. Just tea, sweating in the heat. "To peace," he said. And for the first time in 3 generations, Macaulay's and Dalton's raised their cups together. After the toast, the air in Ida's yard shifted. Not completely. There were still stiff shoulders, sideways glances, whispers that curl like smoke, but something invisible cracked open. A door that had been bolted for 3 generations suddenly swung just enough to let light in. The band, unsure what to keep playing, struck up an old fiddle tune. Children chased fireflies between the tables, not caring what last names the grown-ups carried. June's hand never left mine. I could feel her trembling with relief and fear at once, like a bird perched too close to the storm. My father ate in silence, methodical, as if chewing cornbread could keep him from chewing words he might regret. Clark Dalton sat 2 tables away, stiff as a fence post. When their eyes finally met across the yard, neither man looked away. For a long, tight moment, I thought the old feud would flare again. But then Dad gave a curt nod, the kind men in our town used to say, "I see you, and I'll tolerate you." Clark returned it, slower, almost grudging, but he returned it. That nod was worth more than any sermon. I walked among the guests, refilling drinks, thanking neighbors, try to act like a host instead of man waiting for an explosion. Every time someone laughed, I exhaled. Every time a chair scraped, my stomach knotted. Yet the evening kept moving forward, stubborn as a river. At one point, June Dalton approached my grandmother Ida. I froze, expecting sparks. But Luann bent low, voice trembling. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the Riverland, for the things our mothers said, for letting it live this long." Ida studied her, eyes sharp as ever. "You can't mend 40 years with one apology," she said. Then she set down her cane, touched Luann's arm, and added, "But you can start." I saw tears gather in Luann's eyes, and for the first time, I believed they meant it. Later, as lanterns flickered and cicadas softened into night, June and I had our first dance. No ballroom, no string quartet, just a fiddle, a guitar, and voices humming along. My boots scuffed the dirt, her dress brushed my knees, and for a moment the world shrank to just us. I whispered, "This is ours, not theirs, ours." She nodded against my shoulder, and I felt the tremor ease. Yet peace is heavier than war. War gives you clear enemies, sharp lines, excuses to hate. Peace demands trust, patience, humility, things far harder to carry. I looked around the yard. My father chewing his words. Clark holding his pride like a brittle bone. Ida clinging to her cane. Luann dabbing her eyes. All of them old soldiers trying to learn a new language. As the night thinned and guests drifted home, I stayed on the porch, watching the lanterns sway. Clark came to stand a few feet away. We didn't speak at first. Finally he muttered, "I thought you'd cancel it all." "I almost did," I admitted, "but June deserves better." "We both do." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Your grandmother's right. We can't fix decades overnight. But I don't want our kids to inherit this war." For once, I heard honesty instead of pride. I nodded, then helped me bury it. He didn't answer right away. But when he walked back toward his car, he left me with a final glance. Not friendly, not warm, but no longer a threat. That was enough. Inside, June slept on Ida's old quilt, her face peaceful at last. I touched the letter in my pocket, the one that had nearly broken us. Tomorrow I'd burn it in the fire pit, not to erase it, but to keep it from being found by the next generation. Because peace begins not with forgetting, but with refusing to hand the feud forward. The last guests left after midnight, their taillights fading down the dirt road like fireflies that had lost their glow. The yard was scattered with paper plates, half-drunk cups of tea, and chairs knocked sideways by children's games. The lanterns still swayed in pecan branches, their candles burning low, throwing soft halos over the tables. I sat on the porch steps with June beside me, our hands twined together. The world smelled of fried chicken grease, cut grass, and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle drifting from the fence line. My grandmother had gone inside hours ago, but I could still hear the creak of her rocker upstairs, a lullaby older than any feud. For the first time since that envelope had landed under my windshield wiper, I let myself breathe all the way down. "You think they meant it?" June asked quietly. "Your parents?" She nodded. I thought of Clark's stiff back, of Luann's trembling voice, of the way they had looked at each other more than at me when they spoke their apology. "I think they're tired," I said finally, "tired of fighting. And sometimes being tired is the first step toward telling the truth." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "I don't want to raise our kids under the shadow." "You won't," I promised. "Not if I can help it." Silence stretched, comfortable for once. I pulled the envelope from my pocket and held it up to the lantern light. Its words were still cruel, still sharp, but they no longer cut me. They were just ink on paper. I walked to the fire pit, struck a match, and set the letter alight. The flames licked greedily, curling the corners, devouring the sentences that had nearly torn us apart. June stood beside me, watching until it was nothing but ash. "We'll keep the story," I said softly, "but not the weapon." Dawn crept in while we cleaned the yard. The sky went from indigo to pale gold, the cicadas giving way to birdsong. My father returned with coffee and biscuits from a gas station, his way of saying he hadn't fled. Clark arrived not long after, carrying a box of leftover boards from his yard. "For the tables," he muttered. Dad grunted, but he didn't walk away. By noon they were hammering side by side, repairing one of Ida's sagging benches. They didn't talk much, but the sound of nails striking was music enough. Ida watched from the porch, cane tapping the floor. Told you boys, she said. You can't plant bitterness forever. Soil won't stand for it. Something else will grow. That night, when June and I lay down on the same quilt where generations before had argued and reconciled, I felt the weight of peace settle in my chest again. Not light, not easy. Peace is heavy, heavier than anger, because you have to carry it every day. But it was ours now. Our children would know the story. How their great-grandmothers quarreled over a river bend. How their grandfathers turned business into battle. How an unsigned letter nearly ended a wedding. They would know. But they would also know that love can outstubborn hate. That lanterns still burn when grudges go dark. I closed my eyes to the sound of June's breathing, steady as the Alabama night. Tomorrow the feud would still exist in memories, in scars, in whispers. But tonight it had ended in laughter, music, and the fragile courage of forgiveness. And that, I realized, was enough.